Hello everyone and welcome to Food Composition Explained. My name is Fernanda Grande and I'm here to share some knowledge and experiences on food composition with you. And in this video, I will show you an important component that should be presented in food composition tables, that is the edible or also inedible portion. So in this video, we will discuss what is the edible portion, the relevance of this information, and what we should consider when selecting the coefficients to apply to our data. So every time we want to convert the amount of food consumed into nutrient intakes, and it includes energy, macro or micronutrients, we need to go to look for this information in a food composition table. Therefore, we need to consider that in most of the cases, the amount of nutrients presented in the food composition tables represent the amount of nutrients in the edible portion of the food. So it means that if we want to convert the food quantities into nutrient intakes, we need to consider the edible part of the food only. So what is the edible portion? So the edible portion refers to the part of food that is usually eaten. So many foods have an inedible portion, which refers to the parts that we don't eat. So every time we want to convert the amount of foods into the amount of nutrient intakes, we need to have the weight of the edible part of the food. But in many cases, this is not what we have. So especially when we are using, for example, data from household budget and consumption surveys, we have the amount of the food as purchased, as it is available in the supermarket. So it includes the inedible part. So it is extremely important that we consider that we remove the inedible parts from our amounts before converting the amount of food into the nutrient intake estimations. So this is why the edible portion is an important component and that should be included in the food composition tables. And usually the edible portion, the edible part of the food, is part of a good food description in a food composition table. So, as I mentioned, the edible portion is needed to transform the weight of foods as purchased to the edible part of the food. So, usually in food composition tables, these values can be expressed either as a coefficient or a percentage of the food. So let's take banana as an example. So here we have the banana, how it is purchased in the supermarket, so including both edible and inedible part. So if we go to a food composition table and we have this information either of the edible or the inedible part, we will see the data as I'm presenting here. So in our example here, we have that 63% of the banana corresponds to the edible part, to the fruit itself, to the flesh, and the other part, the 37 or 0.37, if we are expressing as a coefficient, corresponds to the peel, that is the inedible part. And how can we use this information to convert our amount of food as purchased to the amount of food as consumed? So we can use, for example, here, if we have 150 grams of whole banana as we buy at the supermarket, we have to multiply by the edible coefficient, and then we will have the amount of edible part in this banana. And here in our example, it corresponds to 94.5 grams of banana of flesh. So this is the amount that we are going to use to convert the data that is presented in the food composition table as expressed per 100 grams of edible portion. So we are going to use the 94.5 grams of banana to make our calculations. So the values for the edible or for the inedible part should always be recorded to each food entry in a food composition table. And of course, if we have one of these two values, we can calculate the other. So if the edible part is expressed as a percentage, we can calculate the inedible part, making the calculation of 100 less the edible portion. And if it's presented as a coefficient, we should calculate it as 1 less the edible part. We will have the inedible portion. So we can always convert from one to the other one. So let's see some more examples. So here we have the potato as we buy at the supermarket, and if we look for the information regarding edible and inedible portion, we will find that 85% of the potato represents the edible part and 15% represents the inedible part, that is the peel. Another example here is a food that is ready to eat. So here we have the chicken, and of course that it's not 100% edible. So here we have 66% is the meat and skin that we can eat, and 44% represent the bones. So even when the food is ready to eat, in some cases we may need this information regarding the edible and inedible portion. So this is a very easy concept, but we need to be careful in some situations. So let's see now what can affect the edible or inedible portion. So depending on how the food is purchased or how the food is consumed, we can have different edible or inedible parts for the same food, and it will vary from country to country and sometimes from person to person, because it also depends on the cooking practices and eating habits of each person. So let's see some examples just to make it clear. So let's take chicken breast as the first example. So we can have the chicken breast available for purchase as we are seeing here. So the chicken breast with skin and bones. So if we buy the chicken like this, we can have that the edible part is the chicken breast with skin, meaning that we have removed the bones and some fat and the section losses. So here in this case we would have that the edible part is 0.74 of the food as purchased. But for the same food we can have a second option. We can, in addition to the bones and some fat and the dissection losses, we can also remove the skin. So instead of having that 74% of this food is edible, we have here that when we remove also the skin, the edible portion will be 65% of the food. So as you can see here, it will affect our amount. So if we start with the chicken breast with bones and skin, we can have these two options depending on the person that is going to eat the food. Of course that not only the edible portion changes here, in this case the composition of the food will also change. So we need to be sure that we are applying the edible portion that corresponds to the food that we want to represent at the end. Another option, instead of buying the chicken breast with the bones, the person can buy the chicken breast already boneless, so with the skin only in our example here. So in this case, again, we can have two options of edible portion. If the person is going to eat the chicken breast with the skin, the edible portion will be equal to 1. So everything that will be purchased will be also consumed. But if the person removes the skin, we will have that 91% or 0.91 of the food will be consumed because we are removing the skin. So in this case, we can see here that the edible or inedible part will depend both on how the food's purchased and how the food's consumed by the person. Let's see here another example. So here we have the coconut. So if we buy the food as we can see here in the picture, we can have that the shell will never be consumed. So the shell will always be an inedible part that is in our example here corresponds to 0.25 or 25% of the food. We can consume from this coconut, we can consume the water. So the water represents 0.27 or 27% of the food. And we can also eat the meat. The meat of the coconut represents almost half of the coconut, so 0.48 or 48% of the food. So depending on the country and the eating habits of the population, we can have that the edible portion will be both meat and water, but in some countries we can have that only the meat or only the water are consumed, so the edible part would be different in this case also. But in some cases, the edible portion will depend on how we are considering that the person is buying the food. So, or how our data is recorded. So let's take an example of orange juice. So we can buy the orange juice ready to drink in the supermarket, and in this case we will consume as purchased, so meaning that the edible portion will be 1 or 100%. But we can have another situation. We can consider that the person is buying the fruit, the fresh fruit, and then is preparing the orange juice. So in this case, we will have to consider that 48% only of this orange will be converted to the juice. So you can see that depending on how we consider that the food was purchased, also we can have very different edible portion coefficients. And the last couple of examples are here for canned beans. So canned beans will depend on how these canned beans are purchased. So for example, if we have here canned beans canned in tomato sauce, as here in our picture, we can consider that the whole content will be consumed. So in this case, the edible portion is equal to 1. But if it was canned in liquid, in brine, we could consider that probably this brine would be drained and only the beans would be consumed. So in this case, we would have that the edible portion is 0.68. And similarly, we can have the fruits canned in syrup. So if we consider that the person will consume the whole content, we will have that the edible portion is 1. But if we want to consider that only the drained solids, only the fruit will be consumed, then in this case for peach, we would have that 0.63 or 63% will correspond to the edible part. So looking at all these examples, we can see that when we are selecting edible portions, either to use or to include in a food composition table, we really need to think how the food is purchased and how the food is consumed. So it is extremely important to take into consideration these two aspects and also to describe very well when we are preparing a food composition table what we are considering as the edible part. So it is important to include the description of the edible or the inedible portion to make it clear for users what we are considering when we are presenting our coefficient or our percentage, since we can see that it can vary a lot for the same food. And to finalize, I just want to leave here where can we find the information regarding the edible and inedible part of foods. So here in this slide, I have listed the main food composition tables that I use as a source of edible coefficients or edible portions. So you can find the link to access in our website, Food Composition Explained, and I will leave the link down here in the description of this video, so you can go to the website and find the link to access all these food composition tables. And another good source of edible portion coefficients is this publication. It's old, but it's gold. So because it has a lot of information, so as you can see here in this slide, this publication lists for each food many different proportions of edible and inedible parts, including raw and cooked foods, and it's very detailed and very well described. So even though it's a bit old, we can use it as a source of edible and inedible parts. And again, you can find the link to access this PDF document down here in the description of this video. Well, that's all for this video. I hope that this information on the edible and inedible portion was useful for you. And if you want to find more information on food composition, you can find it in my website or even in the other videos that we have here in the YouTube channel. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to cover, please leave down here in the comments below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.